The beacon went off at 7:43 station time, and every single screen in my office lit up at the same moment. Not one screen, not two, every screen, 47 incoming channels, all blinking at the same time, all demanding immediate attention, and every single call was from a different alien species. I had a sandwich in my hand. I set it down slowly because something in my gut told me I was not going to get the chance to finish it for a very long time. My name is Kale Voss. I am the lead human ambassador to the Galactic Council, stationed aboard Concord Station, which floats at a politically neutral point in deep space, and serves as the closest thing the galaxy has to a shared government. I have been doing this job for 11 years. I have sat through territorial disputes that lasted 400 meetings. I have watched species who could not agree on the definition of the word border somehow managed to sign treaties together. I have seen a lot of strange things in this building, but 47 calls at once. That had never happened before, not once. I picked up the first channel. It was Ambassador Tale of the Soreth Collective, a species known for being calm under any circumstances. They are cold, logical, slow to react, and almost impossible to shake. Tale's face on the screen was not calm. His secondary eyelids were fully open, which for a Soreth means something between deep alarm and complete panic. Ambassador Voss, he said, you need to see the council bulletin immediately. I closed the channel and opened the next one. It was High Delegate Marova of the Pashali Union. She was already talking before I could say a word. Voss, the bulletin just posted. The Breath have filed a formal declaration. Have you read it yet? Tell me you have read it. I had not read it. I opened the council bulletin feed with one hand while answering another channel with the other. The headline was already at the top of the feed, sitting there in calm, clean text, as if it were announcing a minor scheduling change. Formal declaration of hostile intent for Breath Dominion versus Earth Sector 7 Sol System. I read it twice, then I read it a third time more slowly. The declaration was written in standard galactic script, the common language used for all official council documents. It was formal, precise, and completely serious. The Breath Dominion, a mid-sized empire of 12 star systems, located roughly 300 light-years from Earth, had formerly declared war on humanity. The document cited several reasons. Earth had been operating in deep space for approximately 80 years, which the Breath described as an immature and unstructured presence in civilized space. The Sol System was described as resource-rich and strategically valuable. Humanity was described as an unorganized species with no allied armadas, no formal military doctrine recognized under Galactic Council law, and no meaningful defensive capacity. The declaration ended with a line that I read 4 times before I fully believed I was reading it correctly. The Breath Dominion anticipates minimal resistance and expects the matter to be resolved within a standard cycle. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. 47 channels were still blinking. In the Galactic Council, formal declarations of hostile intent were legal under a very old and very outdated section of Council law called the Prior Claim Protocol. It was a rule created roughly 3,000 years ago to allow established civilizations to formally contest the expansion of younger species into areas of strategic interest. Most council members had been trying to remove this rule from the books for centuries. It had not been invoked in over 400 years because no species had been bold enough or reckless enough to use it in all that time. The breath had just used it against Earth, against my planet, against my people. I answered another channel. It was old. Counselor Bry of the Mavi Confederation, one of the oldest sitting members of the full council. She was so old that her species had been spacefaring before Earth had developed the wheel. She looked at me with enormous ancient eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Kale, she said finally, using my first name for the first time in 11 years of working together, I want you to understand that not every species on this council supports what has been filed. Many of us are deeply uncomfortable. How many? I asked. She paused. Most of us believe the outcome is not in question. We are concerned for Earth's civilian population. There it was. They already thought it was over. They were already thinking about what music would happen after. I thanked her and closed the channel. I sat in the quiet for exactly 30 seconds. I let myself feel everything that was sitting in my chest. I let myself understand the full weight of what I had just read. Then I packed it all away somewhere very deep and very still, and I opened a new channel. This one went directly to the Human Diplomatic Relay, a secure line that connected me to the office of Earth's Unified Diplomatic Command back home. My contact was Deputy Director Clara Hall, a woman I had worked with for 6 years, a former military analyst who had moved into diplomacy because, as she once told me, she found it offered all the complexity of war with the added challenge of not being allowed to raise your voice. She answered immediately. She had clearly been awake for some time. You saw it, she said. I saw it, I said. The Prime Council received it 14 minutes ago. The Defense Assembly is already meeting. She paused. Kale, they're not panicking. That surprised me. They're not. No, a pause there. Angry, something in my chest unnoted. Very slightly. That was the right response. That was a human response. I need everything you can give me, I said. Historical files, military capacity, reports, infrastructure assessments. Every document that shows what Earth has survived and what Earth can do. I need it before the full council session tomorrow morning. Everything. Clara asked. All of it. I said. They think they know what they picked a fight with. They have no idea. I want every single delegate in that council chamber tomorrow to understand exactly who just got their attention. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, I'll have it to you within the hour. I closed the channel. I looked at my sandwich. I picked it up, took one bite, and then put it down again because I realized I had 17 more channels still waiting outside the viewport beside my desk. The stars were doing what they always do, burning quietly, indifferent to declarations and documents and political history, indifferent to the breath, dominion, and their expectations of minimal resistance. I had work to do. I answered the next channel and the next, and the one after that. To each of them, I gave the same short, measured answer. I told them that Earth had received the declaration. I told them that humanity was aware of the situation. I told them that I would be making a formal statement before the full council at the morning session, and that I would appreciate their patience until then. Not one of them believed anything dramatic was going to happen. They were, every single one of them, about to learn Something new about the species they had been too comfortable ignoring for the past 80 years. I worked through the night. By the time the station lights shifted to morning cycle, I had read every document Clara had sent. I had organized the material. I had written my statement 3 times and then deleted it because what I had written was too emotional. What the council needed was not emotion. What they needed was information. Cold, clear, undeniable information. The 4th draft was better. At 85 station time, I walked down the long corridor toward the council chamber. I passed delegates from species I had known for a decade. Several of them gave me looks that were gentle, careful looks, the kind you give someone when you want to be kind, but you cannot think of anything useful to say. One delegate from music, the Harani, reached, touched my arm briefly as I passed. I thanked him and kept walking. When I reached the great doors of the main chamber, I stopped for a moment. Through those doors, sitting in the curved gallery that held 212 seats, were the representatives of every recognized spacefaring civilization in this part of the galaxy. Among them sat Ambassador Draven Kurz of the Breath Dominion, a being with a wide flat head and 6 mouths arranged in 2 rows. He was speaking quietly to his aide. All 6 mouths were smiling. I pushed the doors open and walked in. By the time the session formally called to order, every seat was filled. The chamber had not been full like this in years. Whatever else had happened, the breath had at least managed to get a good audience. I was given the floor third. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked at the 212 faces watching me from the gallery. Then I looked at Draven Kirsch. He met my eyes with a calm, patient expression, the expression of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the formalities to finish. I opened my file and began to speak. Members of the Galactic Council, I said, keeping my voice level and clear, I would like to take a few minutes of this body's time to provide some context about the species the Breath Dominion has chosen to file a declaration. Clears throat against. Some of you know Earth well. Many of you know us only by brief summary. What I am about to share comes from our own recorded history, which is open for review by any council member who requests it. The chamber was very quiet. I am going to tell you what humans have survived, I said, not what we have built, not what we have achieved, what we have survived, because I think that is the most relevant information available to this body right now. I turned to the first page of the file and I began. I talked about the ice ages. First, multiple periods over thousands of years when the climate of Earth turned catastrophically cold, killing enormous portions of every ecosystem on the planet, and humans survived by learning to adapt faster than the environment could change around them. They made tools, they moved, they found new food sources, they endured. I talked about the plagues. I watched several delegates shift uncomfortably as I described what disease had done to human populations across their history, not once, not twice, repeatedly, and every time the species had recovered, not just survived, but rebuilt, reorganized, and continued expanding. I talked about the wars, not in glorifying terms. I was careful about that, simply described scale, duration, and outcome. I described a species that had within living memory of the oldest humans alive today fought a global conflict of such scale and destruction that it reshaped every border on the planet, and then, within a single generation, rebuilt not just physically, socially, politically. The species had built new institutions, new frameworks for cooperation, and expanded outward into space, all within span of time that most galactic civilizations would consider a blink. I talked about the biosphere crisis, the period roughly 40 years ago when humanity's own industrial development had pushed their planetary environment to the edge of collapse. The scientific projections at the time had been by any measure quite grim. I let the council read a few of the projections on the shared screen. I let them sit with the numbers for a moment, then I showed them the current state of Earth's environment, recovery charts, reforestation data, ocean temperature, stabilization curves, a planet that had looked at its own near destruction and said no, not yet. Councillor Bry of the Mavari Confederation leaned forward very slightly in her seat. I had been watching her throughout. She was the best reader of information in the room, and I could see her processing everything I was saying with those ancient, patient eyes. Ambassador Draven Kirsch had stopped smiling somewhere around the plague section. By the time I reached the biosphere data, 2 of his 6 mouths were pressed together in a thin, flat line. The Breath Declaration describes Earth as a species with no recognized military doctrine. I said, that is technically correct under current council classification. What the declaration does not mention is that Earth's history of organized resistance to existential threat is 14,000 years old. What the declaration does not mention is that every time the species has faced something that should have ended them, they treated it as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted. I closed the file 14 hours after receiving this declaration. I said, every major government on Earth had formed a joint body called the Unified Defense Command. Volunteer numbers overloaded every registration system. Within 6 hours, I have the numbers if any member of this council would like to review them. The chamber was absolutely silent. Earth is not asking the Galactic Council to intervene. I said, Earth is not requesting protection. I am here today for one reason only. I want every member of this body to have the correct music information before they decide what position they will take on what happens next. I sat down. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Draven Kirsch cleared his throat and asked to respond. The session chair granted it. He stood and said with a steadiness that I respected, even as I disagreed with every word, that the historical data was interesting but not relevant to the current strategic situation, that Earth's past endurance of natural and internal crises was not comparable music to a formal military engagement with an established interstellar power, and that the Breath Dominion remained confident its assessment. I did not respond. I simply nodded outside the chamber as the session broke for the midday interval. A young Sarath aide approached me quietly. She pressed a data chip into my hand without saying a word and walked away. I looked at the chip. It was marked with the Sarath collective seal. I pocketed it and kept walking. The message on the chip was from Ambassador Tail himself. It was 4 sentences long. It said that the Sarath collective had run their own analysis of the data I had presented. It said their modeling team wanted to revise their initial assessment of probable outcomes. It said they would appreciate a private meeting at my earliest convenience. The last line said, "We may have been too hasty in our conclusions." I smiled just once, briefly, and put the chip in my jacket pocket. The galaxy was starting to do math it had not done before. The numbers were going to keep changing. I intended to make sure of that. Down the corridor ahead of me through the wide viewport that looked out onto deep space, stars were still burning, quiet, indifferent, patient. But something had shifted, and every species in that chamber could feel it, even if they had not yet found the words for it. I went back to my office. Clara had sent another data package. Earth had added 1,700 new volunteers to the Defense Command roster in the 4 hours since I had last checked. The shipyards on the lunar ring had requested emergency operational expansion approval. The galaxy thought it knew what it was dealing with. It was wrong. Nobody in the council wanted to believe it was moving fast. I watched them try to ignore the updates the way you watch someone try to ignore a noise in the walls of a house they have lived in for a very long time. They could hear it. They just did not want to look at what was making it. 36 days after the declaration was filed, I requested a second emergency session of the full council. The request was granted because even the delegates who wanted to look away understood by then that looking away was no longer a reasonable option. I walked into that chamber with a different kind of file. The first session had been about history, about what Earth had already survived. This session was about what Earth was doing right now in real time, and the numbers were the kind that made experienced diplomats very quiet. My contact at the Unified Defense Command was a man named Director Owen Hale, a former logistics officer who had spent 20 years moving supplies across contested space during the early years of Earth's outer system settlements. Owen Hale was not a loud man. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of person who looked at a large and complicated problem, found the most efficient path through it, and walked that path without ceremony. When Clara first connected me to him after the declaration came through, his opening words to me had been, "Tell me what you need from us, and I will tell you what we can deliver." That was the right kind of person to have on the other end of a very difficult phone call. What he had delivered over the past 36 days was, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. The Unified Defense Command had been assembled faster than any political body in Earth's history. This was, historically speaking, not a small claim. Humans had spent centuries being very bad at getting large groups of people to agree on almost anything, and then, occasionally and unpredictably, being very good at it when the circumstances demanded it. The declaration from the breath had created exactly the kind of circumstances that turned that unpredictable switch on. Governments that had been fighting over water rights and trade tariffs 3 months ago were now sharing secure military communication channel. Space agencies that had operated independently for decades were merging their logistics networks, and species that had invented approximately 4,000 different languages, celebrated roughly 600 different major religions, and maintained somewhere in the range of 200 sovereign nations, had looked at a common external threat and done something that had surprised even the most optimistic analysts on Earth. They had agreed quickly, without much argument. The Soreth Collective's Intelligence Division had filed a Revised report on human political cohesion 20 days into the buildup. I obtained a copy through back channels. Their original assessment had rated the probability of Earth achieving meaningful unified military command within 90 days at 11%. The revised report did not include a new probability estimate. Music in the margin. Someone had written a note in Sareth script. I had it translated. It read, modeling framework may be insufficient for this species. I found that deeply satisfying. In the council chamber, I presented the build-up data in sections. The first section was personnel. The Unified Defense Command had processed and inducted more volunteers in 36 days than the Breath Dominion's entire standing military numbered on paper. I let the council look at the comparative figures for a full minute before I moved on. Several deets asked for the figures to be displayed again. I left them on the shared screen. The second section was industrial capacity. This was where I had to be careful because the raw numbers were the kind that could read as threatening, and I did not want to alarm the species in the room who had nothing to do with any of this. I presented the shipyard data as clearly as I could. Earth had 17 major orbital construction platforms. Before the declaration, those platforms had been operating at roughly 40% of their maximum capacity, building commercial vessels, research ships, and infrastructure transports. Within 2 weeks of the declaration, every platform had been shifted to full military production. Civilian construction had been suspended by mutual agreement across all relevant corporate and government entities with full compensation guaranteed. Third section was the part I had been most careful about preparing because it required some cultural explanation that the council might not easily grasp without context. Humans play games. This is something that might seem like a small detail, but it is not. For as long as humanity has existed, they have played games that involve strategy, competition, resource management, and the simulation of conflict. In the last 50 years, as computing technology had advanced, those games had become extraordinarily sophisticated. Hundreds of millions of humans had spent significant portions of their lives playing detailed simulations of large-scale logistics operations, real-time tactical planning, resource allocation under pressure, and coordinated multi-unit combat, not because they had to, because they enjoyed it. I explained this to the council. Delegate Pry of the Haveth Assembly, who was seated 3 rows up and slightly to my left, raised a hand. Ambassador Voss, she said, are you describing recreational combat simulation as a form of military training? No, I said, I am describing it as a cultural practice that produced entirely by accident hundreds of thousands of people who already understood operational logistics, tactical coordination, and strategic planning at a sophisticated level before they ever signed up for the defense command. Delegate Pry was quiet for a moment. That seems, she said carefully, like an unusual coincidence. It does seem that way, I agreed, unless you understand that humans have always treated difficulty as a puzzle to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. They make games out of hard things. They always have. It turns out that when the hard thing stops being a game, the skills transfer. I gave the council the recruitment specialization breakdown. 42% of new defense enlists in the first 2 weeks had prior experience in logistical or strategic fields. Of those, a significant portion had acquired that experience not through formal training but through years of competitive simulation. The chamber had gone very still by this point. I looked at Draven Kirsch. He was sitting straight in his seat and his expression was controlled, but his hands on the desk in front of him were pressing down a little too firmly. I had watched enough diplomatic sessions to know what that looked like. It looked like someone who was reevaluating something important and not finding the new evaluation comfortable. The fourth section of my presentation was about Earth's history of industrial mobilization, not ancient history this time, recent history, living memory history. I walked the council through the documented cases in which Earth had faced a large-scale production challenge and converted civilian industrial capacity to meet it with speed that outside observers consistently underestimated. I was precise about this. I used numbers from the records without additional commentary. The numbers spoke clearly enough on their own. By the time I finished the fourth section, Counselor Bree had stopped taking notes. She was simply watching me with an expression that was difficult to read. Later, after the session, she would tell me privately that she had been present as a young delegate for the last time. The prior claim protocol had been invoked 400 years ago. She said that the species who had been the target of that declaration had sent a representative to the council who wept openly and asked for mercy. She said she had not expected the human representative to bring data. I did not point out that mercy requires believing you need it. Outside the chamber, in the hours after the session ended, the diplomatic traffic changed noticeably. I could feel it in the way requests came in the language people used when they stopped me in corridors, in the fact that 3 separate delegations requested bilateral meetings with me within the same afternoon. The Sorith Collective's request came through officially now, not through a quiet data chip. Ambassador Tail himself sent the request marked as a priority consultation and attached a note that said they wished to discuss the terms of a mutual recognition agreement. This was diplomatic language for something quite specific. It meant they wanted to make sure that when things resolved as they now apparently believed things would resolve, Earth would remember who had treated them respectfully during the process. I forwarded the meeting request to Clara with a note that said, "They Soreth want to be our friends now. Schedule them for next week." Clara responded in less than 2 minutes. Her message was 4 words. I already knew that. The second request came from the Havath Assembly, specifically from Delegate Pry, who wanted to discuss what she called academic exchange opportunities between Earth institutions and Havath research bodies. I found this one almost charming in its transparency. They had heard about Earth simulation culture and they wanted to understand music it better. The academic language was polite cover for what was essentially a request to be briefed on a capability they had not previously considered relevant. The third request was the one that meant the most to me. It came from an old delegate named Counselor Gareth of the Ven Compact, a species so ancient and so settled that they rarely engaged in bilateral meetings with anyone. Gareth was one of the original architects of the Council's current charter. He had been in this building for longer than Earth had been in space. His message was Short, it said, I would like to speak with you privately, Ambassador Voss. I have a question that I would prefer to ask without an audience. I went to his office that evening, his question when he finally asked it after nearly 20 minutes of quiet conversation about other matters was this: how are they not afraid? I thought about it carefully before I answered. They are afraid, I said. That is not the issue. They are very good at being afraid and doing things anyway. He considered this for a long moment. That is strange, he said. Quietly, not to them, I said. He nodded slowly, and for a while neither of us said anything. Through the large viewport behind his desk, the stars stretched in every direction, ancient and burning, the same stars that had watched every species in this building find their way into space, each one carrying their own history, their own particular kind of courage or caution. When I was young, Gareth said, eventually a colleague told me that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a species that does not know it should be afraid. I believed that for a very long time. He looked at me. I think I was wrong, he said. I think the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a species that knows it should be afraid and chooses not to stop anyway. I said nothing. I just let the statement sit. That night back in my office, Clara sent me an update from the Defense Command. The first elements of the forward fleet were completing assembly. Owen Hale had sent a personal note attached to the report. It was short. It said, tell them we are coming when we are ready. Tell them it will be soon. I read it twice, then I pulled up the council directory and drafted a short notice to be formally filed the following morning. It was a single paragraph. It stated that Earth's Unified Defense Command had achieved initial operational readiness and that the human government wished to make clear to all interested parties that it intended to address the declaration against Earth through direct and complete resolution. It was formal language, clean language, the kind that left nothing ambiguous. In the hallway outside my office, I could hear the station settling into its night cycle. The quiet hum of life support and artificial gravity, the distant sounds of other delegations still working late. The Breath Dominion section of the station was noticeably quiet. They had not requested any bilateral meetings. They had not issued any updated statements. I thought about what that silence meant. Then I thought about Owen Hale and Clara and all the people back home who had not waited to be asked, who had not waited to be organized, who had simply looked at a very large problem and started solving it. I sat down at my desk and I started writing, not a diplomatic report, not a formal notice, just writing. Some of it I would never send to anyone. It was just for me, a way of processing the week's music I had been living through. I wrote about the first night and the 47 channels blinking. I wrote about the way the council chamber had sounded when the numbers started coming in too fast for anyone to comfortably ignore. I wrote about Gareth's question and the answer I had given and the long silence that followed it. I wrote, I think the part they keep failing to understand is that it is not that we do not fear things. We fear things more intensely than most species I have encountered. The difference is that we decided a very long time ago, somewhere in the deep part of our history where nobody was writing anything down, yet that fear was information, not instruction. It tells you what is dangerous. It does not tell you what to do about it. Those are two separate questions, and we have always been very good at keeping them separate. I stopped writing and looked at the stars outside the viewport. The first fleet was out there somewhere, music, somewhere in the dark between here and the Breath Dominion's border, somewhere. Owen Hale was checking manifests. Somewhere people who had signed up to do something very hard were doing it anyway. Because that is what people do when it matters. I saved the document and closed it. There was more work to do in the morning. The first real intelligence revision came in on day 41. I was in the middle of a meeting with the Sarath Collective's trade liaison when my secure channel lit up. The message was flagged Priority 1, which meant it had bypassed the queue entirely. I excused myself, stepped into the adjoining room, and read it. It was from Owen Hale. 3 lines. Fleet Element Alpha has reached the staging point. Numbers are confirmed. We are ahead of schedule by 11 days. You should know that we looked at what we had and decided we could do more, so we did more. The revised capacity figures are attached. I opened the attachment. I stood very still for a moment, then I went back into the meeting room, apologized to the Sarath liaison, and rescheduled for the following day. She looked at my face and did not ask questions. Sarath are good at reading body language, and whatever she read on my face told her that the conversation was genuinely over for the day. I sent the numbers to Clara with a one-word message. And GT confirm. And GT, she confirmed in 4 minutes. Yes, we went back and ran them twice. The numbers are right. The Verith Dominion had built their strategic assessment on a set of assumptions that were at the time they made them not entirely unreasonable. Earth was young in space terms. Earth's publicly visible military infrastructure was modest by galactic standards. Earth's history of internal conflict suggested that achieving unified strategic command would take considerable time, during which a rapid and decisive first strike could fracture political will before a coherent defense could be organized. Every single one of those assumptions had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in ways that required minor adjustment, wrong in ways that required a complete reevaluation of the strategic picture. The capacity numbers that Owen Hale had sent me represented a fleet that was, by conservative estimate, 3 times the size of what the best informed intelligence analysis in the Galactic Council had projected Earth could field within 60 days. The Verith Dominion's own intelligence estimate, which had been filed as part of the declaration process and was therefore a matter of council record, had projected Earth's fielded fleet strength at something significantly lower. The actual number was not close to their projection. It was not even in the same range. I thought about how to handle the council strategically. I could release the numbers that would send a clear message to the breath and to every watching species simultaneously. It would also risk coming across as aggressive posturing, which was not the tone I wanted to set. Earth was not trying to frighten the galaxy. Earth was trying to solve a specific problem, or I could share the numbers through quieter channels, the kind of backroom information sharing that diplomats sometimes describe as ensuring relevant parties have accurate context. This approach was slower but more controlled. In the end, the decision was taken out of my hands, which is how things often go. The VTH Dominion had their own intelligence network, their Analysts were not incompetent. It took them 3 more days, but by day 44, their lead intelligence officer had clearly filed a revised assessment with their government because the breath delegation's behavior on the station changed noticeably where they had previously been relaxed and communicative with other delegations. They became quiet and deliberate. Ambassador Draven Kirsch stopped joining the informal diplomatic gatherings that happen every few evenings in the station's common areas. He started working late. His aides looked tired. I watched this happen the way you watch weather coming in over open water. Steady, measurable, inevitable. On day 47, Draven Kirsch requested a private meeting with me. I granted it. We met in one of the smaller conference rooms off the main corridor, a neutral space with a round table and no seating hierarchy. I arrived first and chose a chair facing the door. He arrived 3 minutes later. With a single aide, he sat down across from me and said without preamble, "The Breath Dominion is open to discussing terms of resolution." I kept my expression neutral. I had been expecting this conversation, but I had not been certain when it would come, and I had thought carefully about how I wanted to approach it. What I said next mattered. What I said next would carry back to every listening party in the building. I appreciate you raising this directly, I said. I will transmit your willingness to the Unified Defense Command and request guidance on how Earth wishes to proceed. He nodded. We would welcome an early dialogue. I understand, I said. I will be in contact. That was the whole meeting, 11 minutes start to finish. Clara was on the line within 2 hours of me filing the report. They broke, she said, and there was a particular quietness in her voice that I recognized. She was not celebrating, she was processing. They are open to discussion, I said carefully. Kale, she said. Owen's response is that we have no interest in discussing anything until we reach full operational readiness, as originally planned. That is going to look stubborn from the outside. Yes, Clara said. Owen says that is acceptable. I thought about this for a moment. Owen Hale was not an unreasonable man. He had a reason for this position that went beyond stubbornness. If Earth negotiated now from a position of obvious strength, but before demonstrating full commitment to that strength, there would always be a question. Some future species watching from a distance might conclude that the threat had been partly a bluff, that Earth would mobilize to a point and then stop when given the option. Owen wanted that question removed. He wanted the galaxy to have no doubt about what full commitment looked like. Tell him I understand, I said. I will manage the council side. Managing the council side meant 2 things. First, it meant keeping the peace with the delegates who were growing nervous. A human fleet of this size moving toward Breath territory, even in a fully defensive and legally supported context, made certain species uncomfortable. Not because they thought Earth was wrong, but because large deployments in any direction tended to make species who had spent centuries building careful balances of power feel unsettled. I spent a significant amount of time in those weeks having careful, quiet conversations with delegates who needed reassurance that this was a contained situation with a specific and limited resolution in mind. Second, it meant staying close to the intelligence feeds because the picture was shifting in interesting ways. The most interesting development during this Period was not military, it was commercial, specifically it was the behavior of shipping companies and trade networks that operated in the space between Earth and Breath territory. In the weeks following the declaration, those shipping routes had gone quiet. Traffic had dropped by more than 70%. This was expected. What was not expected, or at least not expected by most analysts, was what happened next. Substantial portion of that redirected commercial traffic began routing through Earth-adjacent systems, not because it was shorter, not because it was cheaper, because the shipping companies had done their own analysis and they had decided that being on the side of the route that included Earth was the lower risk option. This was not a political statement, it was a financial calculation, but financial calculations made by hundreds of independent commercial operators simultaneously add up to something that functions very much like a political statement. The Soreth Collective's trade liaison, when we rescheduled and finally had our meeting, brought this up herself. She was not a diplomat in the traditional sense. She was an economist, and she saw the world in flows of resources and probabilities. She told me that 3 major commercial insurance bodies had independently revised their risk assessments for operations in the Breatha Dominions territory. All 3 had moved the risk tier upward. None of the 3 had been asked to do this by anyone. They had simply looked at the available information and made a professional judgment. Insurance actuaries are not known for being sentimental, she said. No, I agreed. They have concluded that the Breath Dominion is a higher risk operating environment than it was 60 days ago. She said that conclusion will not change quickly regardless of how this resolves. I nodded. The breath mate. A calculation, I said. The calculation turned out to be wrong. The consequences of wrong calculations tend to persist. She looked at me with the measured, careful expression that Sareth use when they are about to say something they consider important. Ambassador Voss, she said, I want to say something that is not in any official document I have filed with this council. Of course, I said, we have been in space for a long time. She said, my species longer than most in this building, and in that time we have made a considerable study of emerging civilizations, the ones that grow, the ones that struggle, the ones that find their way to something stable. We have developed models, frameworks, categories. She paused. Earth does not fit any of our categories cleanly. I waited. You are too young to have the patience you demonstrate, she said. You are too fractured internally to have the cohesion you have shown. You are too inexperienced militarily to have produced the logistical performance we have observed. You should not be what you are, and yet here you are. She folded her hands on the table. I wanted you to know that we find this genuinely interesting, not alarming, interesting. I thanked her sincerely. It was one of the most honest things anyone said to me during the entire period. On day 52, Owen Hale sent another update. Full operational readiness was now confirmed across all fleet elements. The deployment was proceeding as planned. Earth was not waiting for a reply from the VRI. The message was simple and direct. The fleet was moving. On day 53, the Breath Dominion filed an emergency request with the Galactic Council to have the prior claim declaration formally reviewed for procedural grounds. This was their legal option of last resort. The review process under Council rules could take anywhere from 30 to 90 standard days, the fleet was already moving. The timing of the review request was transparent to every delegate in the building. Counselor Bree called me that evening. They are trying to use the procedural clock, she said. No, I said. Can Earth wait that long? She asked. I am going to ask them, I said. Owen's answer arrived in less than 2 hours. It was one sentence. We are not stopping. The council was watching now, with a kind of focused attention that I had not seen in this building in a long time. Every species had their own interest in the outcome. The old ones watched because they understood that precedents matter. What happened here would become a reference point for a very long time. The younger ones watched because they were trying to learn something. The commercial powers watched because they were recalculating everything. The Breath Dominion watched, I imagined, with an emotion they had not prepared for. On day 58, the first human fleet element reached the edge of Breath space and established a formal defensive perimeter. The Verith responded with a military communique to the council, describing this as an act of provocation. The communique used careful language and cited several sections of council law. It was a well-written document. I read it and then I filed a response that pointed out politely but with complete precision that Earth had received a formal declaration of hostile intent, that under council law this established Earth's legal right to project defensive force to any point within range of the declared aggressor's home territory, and that Earth's fleet deployment was fully within the scope of that right. I attached 3 separate legal analyses from council recognized scholars that supported this reading. I had commissioned those analyses on the day the original declaration was filed. I had been holding them for exactly this moment. The council's legal committee reviewed both filings overnight and issued a brief preliminary opinion. The following morning, Earth's position was consistent with music, existing council law. The Breath's procedural review request was suspended. On day 60, Draven Kirsch requested another meeting with me. This time he brought 2 aides and a legal advisor. I brought Clara's latest briefing summary and a cup of cold coffee. He sat down. He looked at me for a moment. Then music and singing, he said. The Breath Dominion is prepared to accept unconditional withdrawal reparations on the terms Earth has specified in formal public acknowledgement before the full council. I had been waiting for that sentence for 60 days. I kept my face completely neutral. I will convey this to the Unified Defense Command, I said. Owen Hale's response came back in 40 minutes. It was 7 words. We accept. Confirmation of terms to follow. The ceasefire was signed on day 63. I remember sitting in my office afterward, not doing anything in particular, just sitting and being still for a while. Clara called and we talked for a long time, not about logistics or deployments, but about smaller things. She told me that her daughter had started school last month and that Owen Hale had reportedly cried at the end of his staff meeting when the ceasefire was confirmed, which I believed completely, because I had not until that moment fully allowed myself to feel how tense the whole period had been. There is something about a thing being over that lets you feel retroactively how much weight you were carrying while it was happening. It is a strange quality of relief. You only fully understand the size of the burden once you are no longer holding it. Outside my office, the station was quieter than it had been. In weeks, I could hear my own thoughts. Clearly, I thought about the fleet, which was now beginning the formal process of standing down from operational posture. I thought about Owen Hale's manifests and Clara's briefing files and the 47 channels that had been blinking the morning this all started. I thought about the insurance actuaries who had moved the breath Dominion up a risk tier. I thought about how none of it had been inevitable. Hell, at every point things could have gone differently, and how the reason they had not gone differently was not luck and not fate, but just people, large numbers of ordinary people making a very large number of individual decisions to show up and do what was needed. That is all any of it ever is when you look at it. Honestly, people deciding in small moments and large ones to keep going. I finished the cold coffee. There was still work to do, and the morning was going to come early. The formal acknowledgement session took place 31 days after the ceasefire. It was scheduled for the main chamber, full council present, on a morning when the station lights came up slowly through the golden amber tones that the environmental systems used to simulate a gentle sunrise. I had always found that feature slightly overdone, but that morning I was glad for it. The station felt in some hard-to-define way like it was trying to mark the occasion properly. I arrived early and took my seat in the human delegation section. The gallery filled in around me over the next 40 minutes, delegate after delegate coming in, taking their places, settling quietly. There was not much conversation. The mood was not celebratory exactly. It was something more like the feeling after a very long and complicated story finally reaches its end, and everyone in the room is still deciding how they feel about it. The session chair called the chamber to order at 9 station time. Draven Kirsch of the Breath Dominion was called to the floor. He stood. He walked to the speaker's position at the center of the chamber floor, which is the position reserved for the most music significant formal statements, the position where species make history or confess it. He stood very still for a moment, and then he began to read from a prepared document. It was not a long statement. The council rules for formal acknowledgement under the ceasefire terms required a specific set of elements: admission that the declaration had been filed, acknowledgement that the declaration had been resolved on the terms agreed, and formal renunciation of any future claim under the prior claim protocol against the cited party. Draven Kirsch read each section in order in a clear and steady voice. He did not rush. He did not stumble. Whatever I thought of the Breath Dominion's decision to file that declaration, I could not fault the ambassador's composure in that moment. It takes a particular kind of dignity to stand in a room of 212 representatives and say in precise formal language that you were wrong about something. I watched him read. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. I had thought I would, but what I actually felt was quieter than that, something closer to the feeling of a long mathematical problem finally resolving into a clean answer, not triumph, just completion. When he finished, he returned to his seat. The session chair asked if any member of the council wished to make a formal statement regarding the resolution. Several delegates spoke. Councillor Bree made a short, precise remark about the importance of the prior claim protocol reviews, which had been launched independently by the council's legal committee and was now formally underway. The old rule that had allowed The declaration to be filed in the first place was going to be examined very closely, and Bree's gentle but precise language made clear that she expected it to emerge from that examination significantly amended. Ambassador Tail of the Sareth Collective spoke briefly and said that his government believed the resolution demonstrated the capacity of the Council as existing legal frameworks to manage even extreme situations, provided all parties operated in good faith. This was generous and slightly revisionist, since the Council's frameworks had barely kept pace with events, but it was the kind of thing that needed to be said for the record, and I respected that Tail was the one who said it. I was asked if the human delegation wished to make a statement. I stood and said that Earth appreciated the Council's engagement throughout the process, that Earth remained committed to its responsibilities as a member of the galactic community, and that humanity looked forward to productive relationships with all Council members going forward. I sat down. It was the shortest statement I had ever made before the full Council. I had written a longer one and then removed everything that was not essential. The situation did not need more words. The situation had already said everything it needed to say. After the session, the usual informal period followed, where delegates lingered in the chamber and in the corridors, talking in small groups, making the kind of quiet political calculations that happen in person rather than through formal channels. I moved through these conversations, slowly, taking time with each one, because I understood that this period mattered. The formal resolution was finished. The informal reconstruction was just beginning. Several delegates I had barely spoken to in years approached me. This was not surprising. Earth was not the same. Footnote: it had been 65 days ago. The conversations were careful and exploratory, the kind where both sides are trying to understand what the new situation means without committing to any specific position too quickly. I was patient with all of them. I had learned over 11 years that patience in these moments is not weakness. It is how trust gets built, slowly and in person, one careful conversation at a time. Delegate Pry of the Haveth Assembly found me near the eastern corridor and walked with me for a while. She asked a number of questions about Earth's educational systems, specifically about the culture of simulation and games that I had described in the earlier session. I answered carefully and genuinely. She was sincerely curious, and sincerely curious people are among the most valuable you can encounter in any setting. I told her that I would arrange for a formal information exchange briefing if her government wanted to pursue it through proper channels. She said she would send the request through before the end of the week. Old Counselor Gareth passed me near the doors leading to the external observation deck. He did not stop. He simply looked at me as we passed and gave me a very small, deliberate nod. Nothing more than that. I nodded back. I stepped out onto the observation deck, which was a long curved balcony that ran along the outer hull of the station, and looked out into open space. It was not technically outdoors, but the transparent panels that formed the outer wall gave a clear view in every direction, and in the right frame of mind, it was easy to forget you were inside. Music, a station. I stood there for a long time. The past 65 days had been the most compressed period of my diplomatic career. Looking back at them from the observation deck, they had a kind of strange density, the feeling of something that had happened both very quickly and very slowly at the same time, with too much detail packed into too small a space for any of it to feel fully real in the moment. What stayed with me most as I stood there was not the fleet numbers or the council sessions or the ceasefire terms. What stayed with me was the feeling early in the process of watching 47 channels blink simultaneously and understanding that every single one of those delegates expected Earth to lose, not because they were cruel, because they were calculating, experienced, rational observers of civilizations, and by every model they had, Earth should not have been capable of what it proceeded to do. And then Earth had proceeded to do it. Anyway, I thought about a conversation I had with Clara in the very early days, just after the first session, when I had told her about the looks the delegates had given me in the corridors, the gentle looks, the careful ones. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you know what I think the biggest mistake anyone makes about us is?" I had asked her what they look at how young we are in space terms, she said, and they assume that means we're young in every sense. They don't account for the 14,000 years before we left the atmosphere. They don't account for everything we learned during all that time. They see a species that's been in the galaxy for 80 years and they think they're dealing with an 80-year-old civilization. Pause. We're not 80 years old. We brought everything we are to space with us. I had written that down afterward. I had read it several times during the process when I needed the clarity of it. Standing on the observation deck, looking at the stars, I thought about what the next years were going to look like. Earth was not the same in the galaxy's eyes as it had been 3 months ago. That was simply true, and there was no use pretending otherwise. Some of what changed was going to be useful. New partnerships, new opportunities, relationships that had previously been difficult to initiate because our standing had been unclear. The Sarath Collective had already forwarded a draft framework for a mutual recognition agreement through proper channels. The Havath Assembly's educational exchange request had arrived as Delegate Pry had promised before the end of the week. 3 other species had sent preliminary inquiries through back channels, not yet formal enough to call requests, but present enough to track. Some of what changed was going to require careful management. There are species in the galaxy who respond to demonstrated strength not with respect but with weariness, and weariness in diplomatic terms can become friction if it is not handled thoughtfully. I made a mental note of which delegations had been noticeably quiet since the ceasefire and flagged them as priorities for personal engagement over the coming months, not because they were adversaries, because they were uncertain, and uncertainty in diplomatic context is best addressed directly and early, and some of what changed was going to take a very long time to fully understand. The prior claim protocol review was going to reshape several foundational assumptions about how the Council handled emerging civilizations. That process would take years, and the outcome was not predetermined, and it was going to require consistent, sustained engagement from the human delegation to ensure the result was fair and durable. That was a long game, and I was prepared to play it. I had been thinking over the course of the past days about something Gareth had said to me in his office the night I had gone to answer his question about why humans were not afraid. He had said That the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was a species that knows it, should be afraid and chooses not to. Stop anyway. I had let that statement sit with me for a long time. I kept turning it over, examining it from different angles. I did not entirely agree with the framing, and the longer I sat with it, the more I understood why. The species that Gareth was describing, the ones who are genuinely indifferent to danger, who move through the galaxy on pure momentum without processing the weight of what they are doing, those are not actually what humanity is. Gareth had seen something real, but I thought he had named it slightly wrong. The thing that had happened over the past 65 days was not the product of fearlessness, it was the product of something more complicated than that. It was the product of a species that had, over a very long time, developed a particular relationship between fear and action that most galactic civilizations had never been forced to cultivate, not because humans were brave in some innate biological sense, but because they had spent 14,000 years in an environment that demanded repeatedly and at enormous cost that they learned to function under pressure, not to eliminate the pressure, not to pretend it was not there, just to function anyway. Music that is not the same thing as not being afraid. That is something harder than not being afraid. I leaned against the railing of the observation deck and watched the stars. For a while longer, the station turned slowly on its axis, and the stars shifted imperceptibly, the way they always do. Patient and indifferent and enormously old. My commune vibrated. I looked at it. It was Clara. The message was short. Owen says, the last fleet element is at full stand-on. Everyone is coming home. I typed back, good, tell him he did something worth telling people about. Her reply came 30 seconds later. He says, the same about you. I put the comm unit away somewhere in the building behind me, in offices and conference rooms and corridors. The work of the council continued. Disputes to manage, agreements to negotiate, the endless and essential business of species trying to share a very large universe without causing each other more trouble than necessary was not glamorous work. Most of it was not dramatic. Most of it was exactly what it looked like: careful, patient, incremental effort in the direction of something more stable than what existed before. But I had chosen this work 11 years ago because I believed in what it was building toward, even when the progress was invisible, even when the setbacks were large, even when the room full of experienced delegates looked at me with gentle, careful expressions and assumed they already knew how the story ended. They had been wrong about that. They were going to be wrong about other things in the future. And every time they were wrong, the story would continue in a direction they had not expected, that I thought was the most essentially human thing of all. Not the fleet, not the speed, not the numbers, the insistence on continuing the story past the point where everyone else thought it was over. I straightened up. The station's morning cycle lights were beginning to shift into the warmer tones of midday simulation. Through the transparent panels above me, the stars were doing what they always do. My comm unit lit up. Again, a new channel request, an unfamiliar delegation ID, not a species I had worked with closely before. I looked at the screen for a moment, then I accepted the call. There was work to do, and I had always been very good at that end.